starting from this session onwards, we are going to start looking at a few of the tools that could be really used from the client side penetration testing. So, till the last session we actually had been looking at a few of the tools that could be used for doing a server side attack. So, having looked at a few tools on the server side, we are going to start looking at a few of the tools that could be used from the client side attacks in this session. So, what exactly is the term client mean? So, as we all would know by now after having completed the first 3 levels of IS course. So, the client or a host will basically mean an endpoint which is used to connect to a network consisting of various kinds of devices. So, the client will basically want certain job to be done by the server, certain maybe certain data to be sent to the server, or a certain response that it is actually expecting from the server back, and so on and so forth. So, the client will basically typically refer to endpoint which is used by the people and which is always the one that is initiating a request for doing a particular job or trying to seek some data from the. Because of the fact that this is going to be used by people, it basically opens up a huge Pandora's box of what kind of possible vulnerabilities could actually be unearthed of, right. Because the moment we say it is going to be used by people in a manual manner or individually, since because of the fact that different people would actually be using the technologies and the tools in different manner, that itself gives us a window of opportunity for a penetration tester, because they would have actually kept some sort of vulnerabilities open when each of the persons is actually using different kinds of mechanisms, right. So, a client side attack is viewed basically as a method to identifying who is connecting to the web application. So, because the moment the attacker understands and identifies the end user and his profile, right, the penetration tester would basically be able to quickly determine what kind of vulnerabilities would be there on the client side systems and use any of those vulnerabilities to gain access or information from a web application, right. So, we will have to remember that we are going to be talking purely about what kind of an attacks are to be injected from the client side and not on the server side, right. So, the idea here is that even though it has got originated from the client and it is not the original intended way from the way the client wants to use the server application for, we will have to be extraordinarily careful as a penetration tester to ensure that the server does not realize that something is actually coming in a malicious manner which is not supposed to be in as part of this particular request at all, right. So, the intelligence here is how beautifully the attacker can sort of mask this particular malicious intent inside a normal request, with which the server thinks that it is actually a normal request which it has to be serviced by it, rather than raising its antenna and starting to determine what kind of maliciousness is inside this request and sort of disregard that particular request, right. In all our subsequent sessions, we are going to be identifying the different type of tools that could potentially be made use of for these requests for these kind of environment situations on the client side, and using those what kind of vulnerabilities could be taken out and listed, and once the vulnerabilities are known, it basically becomes very easy for having those exploited with a different set of tools, right. So, if at all those vulnerabilities are available to be exploited. Now, as we were discussing now, when we are looking at the client side situation, since the client side is always going to be driven by people predominantly, a good amount of social engineering will really help to find out what kind of ways could be used by the penetration tester to sort of inject this payload or attack as part of doing the client side attack. So, humans will always be the weakest links for the target's security posture. So, the more we try to control the end users, naturally, as we all know, we all experience on a day to day basis, the more they will try to bypass policies, right. The less controls you put in place, the less likely that the policies will be followed. So, it is basically like a balance that has to be achieved on both ends without compromising on the basic security, that unauthorized access or no malicious content should find its way into the server through what is actually seeming to be a very legitimate client request, right. So, this basically creates a double edged sword, where we need to decide how to protect end users from cyber threats, and at the same time ensure that they are not subjected to too much of protection, because of which they start getting very innovative in trying to find out how easily they can try to find a loophole to break that protection, right. So, it is basically a double edged sword which has to be handled carefully between the two extremes of too much security on one side and too little security on the other side, thereby compromising the system. So, social engineering is basically by definition the art of manipulating the people into performing actions of divulging information, right. So, essentially whatever the penetration tester is attempting to do as part of the client side attack will be to sort of convince the user that he is actually disclosing information to a legitimate party when it would not be actually be the case, right. So, many client side attacks are based on tricking an end user into exposing their systems to an attack. So, in a few sessions back I was explaining to you about the phishing attack. The phishing attack is one example by which the end user is sort of tricked into believing that he is actually accessing a site that is really the intended site that he wanted to access, whereas in reality it would have been another site which would be looking exactly similar to his site, but in addition to this what the final destination site would be doing, this guy would also be capturing the credentials for it to be made use of later in a malicious manner, right. So, social engineering can range from calling somebody while pretending to be an authorized employee to posting a link on Facebook that claims to be a service while really being a means to compromise the client, right. So, today all the banks give SMS notifications alerting their customers saying that please do not disclose your credit card number, your bank account number, your OTP number and all that if anybody asks you, saying that they are employees of the bank, right. So, why are they doing it? Because this has become a sort of a very popular method by which the potential penetration testers try to do social engineering and get access to information, very important information, financial information from very innocent end users, right. So, this is something that needs to be sort of publicized very much and then sort of prevented, so that people do not fall into the trap. So, some of the best practices for launching a successful attack through this mechanism is first to understand the target, right. So, how do the users try to communicate? So, what kind of environment specific things that they are using which could potentially be made use of as part of getting them to divulge the information, right. So, most of these attacks, if we see, fall under a very common generic format, where they do not try to actually use some very highly innovative mechanisms, but try to target some very innocent end users who might not be, for example, technically very savvy, right, and also they are also very naive to disclose of some critical details to whoever is actually asking for that, right. So, one very common way that is actually adopted today is that if I basically try to go into a Facebook profile of a user and look at what he or she has actually posted for the last 1 year, from a professional tester's point of view, they have enough information with those kind of details to identify what that person is all about and how he could possibly be sort of convinced to partake some critical information, right. So, this is one example by which in the current social media environment of Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, the penetration testers could easily find out details about a particular person before trying to make use of him as an entry point into doing a malicious attack. So, there is a toolkit that is actually available in Kali Linux called as a social engineering toolkit. It was actually created and written by the founder of TrustedSec. So, this particular toolkit is actually implemented by Python. So, it is a completely Python driven tool which is actually completely in open source, so that the users, if they are also very comfortable in Python programming, and if they have their own requirements, they could actually customize this tool to their own requirements. So, this is basically aimed at doing the penetration testing using social engineering. So, this is actually a very popular tool nowadays that is used by security professionals to sort of really test out how rigid a particular organization security is currently. This particular tool is actually sort of used to create some very complicated penetration testing mechanisms with an intent of it not disclosing also to the end user or something like an intrusion detection system detecting the attacks that this particular tool is actually trying to make use of, right. Since all these things are actually possible to be done on the set, this has basically become a very common and a popular tool that is being used for doing and triggering the social engineering attacks today. So, if we actually go into the menu bar of exploitation tools, there is a social engineering tools sub menu that is there in Kali Linux, and we could actually go ahead and select set from there. So, once we actually start it up for the first time, it basically tries to asks us to for agreement on the terms of service and all that, and then it tries to do an update from the GitHub repository of the latest updated versions of those files that is there, right. So, alternatively the user can also go ahead and do a git clone from the GitHub repository directly by doing it in this manner, and then the verification can be done by running the command called sc-toolkit to ensure that the update has been successful and it is also successfully getting initiated, right. So, one sees this kind of an opening menu after this has got initiated successfully. So, if we actually launch the set from here, so we basically see a menu like this with the banner and all that details that is given. So, it also has the details of who has actually implemented this, the trusted sec, and it gives you a menu to decide what exactly do you want to do, right. So, it says social engineering attacks, fast track penetration testing, third party modules, update the Metasploit framework. So, Metasploit is what we actually learnt earlier and so on, right. So, update the social engineering toolkit. So, this is a menu option that will automatically in the backend do the git clone that we saw in the previous slide and so on. So, today we will actually first look at for example purposes trying to do a social engineering attack. So, we select the option 1 there, right. So, in this there are different sub menu options that is possible. So, there is a spear phishing attack vectors. So, the phishing attack vectors is what I was just referring to as a phishing attack sometime earlier, where the end user would not be really in a position to understand that there is a malicious content embedded inside this particular request, and it for all practical purposes it will look like as if it is a very valid request, because of which it will respond back, right. So, that is basically referred to as a phishing attack. So, the website attack vectors and so many different options that is given here, right. So, you could actually read through the help and try to understand each of those options. So, but for our example purposes we will actually try to take the website attack vector. So, we will select option 2. So, here it basically gives different options that is possible. So, the Java applet attack, the Metasploit browser exploit, the credential harvester and so on. So, we will basically depending on what is it that we are attempting to do, we will try to have the appropriate payload attack that from out of this list which could potentially be done on the server, right. So, here if you for example select the Java applet attack method or the Metasploit browser exploit method, it will basically then tell you what kind of options specific to this particular attack that you will have to enter, right. So, it tells you to basically use the Cycloner option. So, Cycloner is a tool that we also saw before where it is basically helpful for cloning the entire site, right. So, I will basically get a copy or a clone of the entire website that we are actually trying to do into my local system, so that it basically becomes easier for me to manipulate or embed some content inside that. So, for this particular purpose it will ask you a few questions, for example if there is a NAT or a port forwarding, right. So, NAT as we would be knowing by now stands for network address translation. So, this is something that will be typically used whenever I need to have a conversion done from a public IP address to a private IP address, as we were discussing in our previous IS3 course, right. So, if at all there is any NAT or port forwarding that is required for the current topology that set is running on through Kali Linux and the server that is being attempted to be connected. So, those details is actually should be printed, should be given as an input here, right. So, whenever the Kali server and the victims are basically connected to different networks, then in all probability you will have to give this particular data by taking in the details either by yourself or by looking at it from the administrator, right. So, what is the IP address or the host name for the reverse connection? So, when there has to be a response back, so what should where should the response be sent to, right. And then the URL you want to clone. So, whatever URL we want to basically have the copy of, and then what exploit that we want to deliver. So, we basically want to use something called as a Windows reverse TCP Meterpreter. So, this is an exploit that is actually will run an executable that establishes an open port. So, it will basically open up a port which the attacker could use for connecting backdoor, right. So, it will try to basically open up a port on that particular victim machine, which the attacker will now know that is available and open, and that open port the attacker will try to actually make use of for getting a full shell access. So, full shell access, as we were seeing in the Metaspoil tool earlier in one of our sessions, would essentially mean that we have the root super user access on that particular shell which is running on that compromised port. So, that is basically what is the exploit that we will actually try to make use of. So, if you see the screen here, it basically gives you the different payloads that is there. So, it tells you about a Windows shell reverse TCP attack, reverse TCP Meterpreter to attacker and all that, and then it gives you a one line description of it. So, among the various payloads that is actually there, we will be selecting this particular option, right. So, because this is what we will actually try to make use of to get full access into that particular machine, right. So, we will select that particular option, and then we will say what is it that we are going to use as the backdoor executable, right. So, the backdoor executable is the different exploits that is actually available here. So, out of that we are going to say that we are going to use this option of backdoor executable, right. So, this backdoor executable is the one that is going to be allowing the attacker to get full access into that particular server on that open port which is going to be opened up by this particular payload that we have selected, right. So, the reverse TCP Meterpreter. So, when we run this, and it will basically throw up a warning message typically, right. So, if I basically have a Java applet in which I have embedded this particular thing, so I will basically get a warning saying that the digital signature cannot be verified, do we want to run still the application. So, most of the times what the end user would actually do is, maybe because of the fact that he is under time pressure, or because of the fact that he is completely ignorant of the possibility of this kind of attack getting triggered through this particular request, right, he will just press the button run. Okay. Now, the moment he presses the button run, this applet is going to run, which as part of the request that it is actually sending to the server, right. It is basically going to have this particular payload also getting executed, and this payload is now going to create a open port on that particular server, right. All this is done completely transparent to the server, and the server does not understand or realize that some kind of a malicious activity like this is actually happening, right. So, if we actually use some kind of a capturing tool, we will find that these kind of traffic keep happening, which has been done by the Meterpreter backfloit the payload that has actually been selected for exploiting, right. Now, after that, if you see, what you actually get is the prompt, and if I run basically the ipconfig command, I see what are the interfaces that are actually available, and I get the complete shell prompt, which is basically what the attacker wanted as part of this, right. So, all this has actually happened again. Please we need to understand this very clearly, that we have tried to attack a particular server from the client side by putting an exploit inside the client code from the browser in such a way that the server, although it has detected that the signature is there is a mismatch, that is not capable of detecting that something like this open port as is going to be getting created on that server. So, faithfully executes whatever it has been asked to execute, and out of that set of instructions that it has been asked to execute, one has been a malicious intent in which it has actually created this open port, which this attacker is actually going to be making use of now, right. So, this is basically a full blown super user privileged access shell that the attacker has now got using that particular open port that has been opened up by this malicious code. Thank you.